Good afternoon. There is some measure of dispute about whether Cecil Rhodes or Rudyard Kipling coined the phrase that to be born British is to win first prize in the lottery of life. I suspect that most people in this hall would echo that sentiment, and I certainly do. It is an honour and a privilege to be born British, and Britain as a country has had its critics, the historians have a go at us, but nonetheless, over a period of centuries, in relative terms, we have been free from tyranny. We permit the expression of religious and political ideas freely. We have a benevolent monarchy, and the rule of law, for the most part, prevails. I'm rather proud of being British, and I think that sometimes we belittle these things. In UKIP, the bulk of the membership are English, which is fair enough, and the bulk of those members, as I would understand it, are resident in the south of England, in London and the home counties and so on. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, of course. But I would wish to make a plea that we don't forget that UKIP are a unionist party. We're not the English Nationalist Party, we're a British party. We're not a party that focuses exclusively on England or English patriotism, not that in any sense is there anything wrong with that. I'm speaking therefore specifically about Scotland. I won't say anything about Wales or Northern Ireland because others have done that, and well, Alan Love to follow me, I believe, will speak about Northern Ireland. So I'm specifically speaking about Scotland, and would wish to promote the idea that in a world where, maybe if we're being honest, there's a little bit of confusion about what UKIP potentially could stand for post-Brexit, assuming Brexit happens, which is a subject in itself. Our unique selling point, I suggest, and this is, as I understand it, official party policy, but I'm sometimes not sure that we make much of it, is that UKIP is in favour of the abolition of, at least in Scottish terms, the Scottish Parliament. It would also include the Northern Irish Assembly, which is pretty well abolished itself anyway, the Welsh Assembly, and in London, the Regional Assembly. But specifically, I'm suggesting these are all, as I'll hopefully highlight, areas of expensive and glorified local government. We want to put the Holyrood Parliament, or I would like to put, and I hope the party would agree, we want to put the Holyrood Parliament in the nearest readily available recycling receptacle. Before I kind of get to that, that's the essence of what I would like to say, but I just want to use, if I might, the opportunity to sort of present just a little, slightly personal anecdote. In the northwest of Scotland, and I sometimes think English people don't spend enough time in Scotland, but in the northwest of Scotland, in the Outer Hebrides, there is an island, Lewis, the island of Lewis. The main town is Stornoway. Like most of the Hebridean islands, it has suffered from emigration, people having to leave for jobs and education. And the population varies from somewhere between 25,000, 30,000. But if you're growing up there, you invariably have to leave. My mother was born there in the year 1928, and as a young girl, when she went to school, she had to learn the English language. She spoke Gaelic as her natural tongue, so to speak. She had to learn English when she went to school. It's a kind of isolated place in its own way, but rich in its own strong Hebridean culture. Well worth a visit. However, why am I mentioning that? Well, the relevance of it is that in 1914, rather an important year, the population of Lewis was 29,603, which is probably the highest it was ever to be. And in that year, which of course was the year the First World War broke out, and it was before conscription, that's rather important, conscription came in 1916, but in 1914, 6,712 natives of that island enlisted in the British Armed Forces, which was a percentage of 19%, which is actually higher percentage population terms than any other part of the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia or New Zealand. So that little island, percentage terms, produced the highest number of volunteers for the British Armed Forces. Of that 6,712, 1,151 paid the supreme sacrifice. Now, these people came from a place which was remote from London and Buckingham Palace and all the symbols of what we might have called the British Empire of that time, but it didn't prevent them from volunteering to serve king and country and making the supreme sacrifice. They were thoroughly British, and I'm rather proud of them. Unfortunately, the people who rule Scotland, I use the word rule in inverted commas today, who rule Scotland, are not interested in people like that. They're not interested in ordinary people who have a sense of patriotism and duty. They are a completely different group of politically motivated people, and totally detached from the ordinary lives of ordinary people in Scotland. And I actually did a little bit of homework. I checked, using Wikipedia, the occupations of the 12 people who currently make up the Scottish Cabinet, or so-called Cabinet. I would prefer to call them the Scottish Sideboard, because a sideboard, as some of you may know, is a kind of Scottish word which refers to an item of furniture whose purpose is not easily determined. So the so-called Scottish Cabinet is made up of 12 people. I won't name them in case we get letters from lawyers, which is quite a common occurrence these days in political parties. Of the 12 people in the Scottish Cabinet, 6 have never done anything other than politics. 6, nothing. Never done anything at all. 1 had a brief stint as a lawyer, enough said. 1 had a job with the media, enough said. 2 were full-time academics, and only 2 out of the 12 have had anything remotely like an ordinary job. Yeah. Nobody has worked in a factory. Nobody has driven a bus. Nobody has worked in Tesco. Nobody has run a business. These people run or try to run, and they're utterly, totally detached, divorced from the ordinary folk that they're supposed to be looking after, an all too common situation. They have a political diet of constantly complaining about alleged political injustices. It's always English or English/British governments that are entirely responsible for all the problems that Scotland has. This is utter nonsense, but they live on this. The media support them 100%, because the media love the Scottish Parliament, since most of them earn a living from it indirectly. Nicola Sturgeon is the personification, who's the so-called First Minister, of course. She's the personification of the maxim that the loudest noise comes from the shallow end of the pool. So, in this sort of 300 years, well, not 300, 280 odd years since the Union was officially founded in 1707, Scotland managed to live quite comfortably within the United Kingdom. It had its own church, Church of Scotland, although it's questionable it's of any value, but it's there. It has its own legal system. It has its own education system. It has its own sporting associations. 2 of the biggest football teams in Europe play in Glasgow. Quite incredible, really. Both of them have fairly impressive histories in playing in European competitions, and they're from Scotland. So we've got a lot to be proud of. But none of that in any way has any impact on the fact that Scotland is still an integral part of the United Kingdom. And that was broadly accepted. Trouble started really just a very brief historical thing. 1967, a lady called Winnie Ewing won a by-election in the Westminster Parliament in Hamilton, just south of Glasgow, and this caused absolute uproar. It was a safe Labour seat. Labour had no problems in Scotland. Suddenly, Nicola Sturgeon, Winnie Ewing wins this seat, 1967, and Harold Wilson immediately sets up the Kilbrandon Commission, followed in 1968 by Edward Heath's Declaration of Perth, all of which were basically designed to talk about giving Scotland some kind of self-government. In 1970, the 1970 general election, the SNP didn't do all that well, and so the issue sort of became a dead duck, for want of a better description. But then along comes 1974, 2 elections, as you might remember. In February 1974, the SNP won 7 seats, and in October they won 11. So panic sets in once again, and people start talking about, again, devolution. Devolution bill was presented to the House of Commons in the mid-1970s, desperate attempt by Labour to stop the SNP. It led to a referendum in 1979. And there's always some clever people out there who don't maybe get the credit they deserve. There was a very clever guy called George Cunningham, who was a Scot from Dunfermline, but he was the MP for Islington in London. And he said, just put in one of these wee sort of amendments to the bill, that the referendum would be given the okay, and there would be a Scottish Parliament if it got 40% approval, which is actually quite difficult. Nobody seemed to pay too much attention to this, but when the vote took place in 1979, the vote was definitely for devolution, but it wasn't high enough to meet the 40% threshold, so that was the end of that. Along came Mrs. Thatcher, and for the next 18 years, devolution just died a death. It was gone, and the SNP kind of were marginalised. However, Mr. Blair came along in 1997, and we had a referendum on the same thing, devolution, in September 1997, and this was very substantial. 3 people out of 4 voted for devolution, and it then became law that the Scottish Parliament would be established. Another very sensible man, now deceased Labour MP Tam Dalyell, who was the Labour MP for Linlithgow, he was never a fan of devolution, and he asked a question which I would suggest has never been properly answered even yet. It was originally posed by Enoch Powell, who was a very strong parliamentarian, but Dalyell kind of took the thing up, the famous West Lothian question, which has still never been answered. How can an MP in Scotland have a say in what goes on in England, but an MP in England doesn't have a say about what goes on in Scotland, in very simple terms? That's nonsense. Utter nonsense. Utter nonsense. But that still is essentially the case. The Scottish Parliament was established in 1999, but it's sometimes forgotten. Westminster remains the supreme body. It's not that the Scottish Parliament governs Scotland. It is very much a devolved Parliament. Westminster remains the supreme body, and various issues such as defence, national security, thankfully, are not devolved to the Scottish Parliament. That would be just unthinkable. So, there is, of course, again, it's wonderful how the best laid plans and so on. The Labour Party obviously thought, when they set up the Scottish Parliament, that they would finish off the nationalists, because you've now got your Parliament, we've now got Labour running the Scottish Parliament, and from their point of view, hopefully running the Westminster Parliament, instead of which it's all gone completely against any expectations. And now the Labour Party are pretty well crushed in Scotland, at least for the moment, and the SNP are running the Holyrood Parliament. And this is the kind of thing that we should do. I mean, I've tried to check this out. The Scotland Act of 1998 used this dreadful phrase, which the media love using, and that's possibly, we use it from time to time, the so-called Scottish Government. Utter nonsense. There is no such thing. There can't possibly be any such thing. We have one government. It's the House of Commons. It's the British government. And the phrase the Scottish Government is used to give it some legitimacy, which it ought not to have. I would suggest if we could have a Scottish Government, we should have a City of Glasgow Government, a South Lanarkshire Council Government, and maybe the street I live, a 14 Turnpike Road Government. We've got to get rid of this rubbish. There's one government. It's the British government, and the media consistently talk about the Scottish Government as if it was some kind of legitimate body in its own. We should use the phrase Scottish Executive. And the SNP, when they talk about the British government, or the UK government, which they tend to use, talk about the UK government in the way they might talk about the French government or the German government. They don't, it's as if it's it's over there, it's nothing to do with us. This is all nonsense. In 2014, as you know, there was a referendum in Scotland about whether Scotland should become independent or not. I remember that day very well. I came home from work and I honestly thought, we've lost. There was St Andrew's flags all over the place. And it's a terrible shame that the flag of Scotland, which is part of the Union flag, has now been hijacked by these people. So you're actually reluctant to fly Scotland's flag because it's symptomatic or it's indicative of independence. But that particular day, there was St Andrew's flags all over the place. I was 100% certain that we'd lost. It was extremely depressing. I just couldn't possibly. But what, of course, happened was the silent majority, as always, who don't say very much but just quietly put their vote in the ballot box, voted to maintain the Union, 55% against 45%. And what does Mr Cameron, the then Prime Minister, do? He sets up the Smith Commission designed to give more powers to the Scottish Parliament. Now, he's just the referendum's lost. Why are we giving more powers to these people? We should be saying we should be an integral part of the UK, full stop. And, of course, in addition to all of that, the wonderful achievement is that Scotland used to have 72 MPs elected to the House of Commons, 72 for years, for decades. Because of devolution, we've now got 59. So we've lost 13 MPs who would have their say in the House of Commons about how Scotland is governed. So that's the end of all this nonsense. The end result is Scotland has a useless government, a so-called government in Holyrood, and has actually lost some of the influence that it should have in the House of Commons in London. So there is a guy, quite a good journalist in Scotland called Stephen Daisley, who writes for the Daily Mail. It's very difficult to get information on this, but he indicated that a poll by no less a person than Lord Ashcroft suggested that up to 1 person in 5 in Scotland would get rid of the Scottish Parliament. 1 in 5. But none of the mainstream parties will campaign for this. Now, I know there's a party in Wales that campaigns for the equivalent down here, but there's nothing like that in Scotland other than us. And we maybe don't, because we're small in numbers, don't make the issue of it we should. There's a market out there. There's people who want rid of this thing, the Scottish Parliament, and we should be voting. We should be campaigning to be elected on the list system to get into the Parliament to put this point across. The Scottish Parliament costs £100 million a year. Staff salaries are £25 million a year. The Scottish media love it. There's a whole army of them stationed in there. And Nicola Sturgeon, who's the First Minister of Scotland, has a salary, which I did check, of £155,680. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, who's currently, of course, Mr Johnson, earns £153,900. So the First Minister of Scotland earns more than the Prime Minister. Check it for yourself. That is absolutely correct. So it's a glorified local government. Just glorified local government. By all means, I'm not arguing, don't misunderstand me about local government, but let's have local government in terms of our cities and towns. What we've got in Holyrood is glorified local government with all kinds of titles and salaries and rubbish given to these people. We should get rid of it. They serve no useful purpose of any kind. Basically, finally, what do you put in its place? Well, we basically go back to where we used to be before 1999. The Secretary of State for Scotland used to be a person of some substance. Bruce Millen, George Younger, they were in the cabinet, they had their say. We had a Scottish Grand Committee, which dealt specifically with Scottish affairs, but these people were still linked to the House of Commons and the sort of British political scene, for want of a better description. There's no reason why we can't go back to that. If others have a different view on it, fine. There may be ways of playing around with that, but the end result is we're an integral part of the United Kingdom, and we have people who are speaking out for the interests, Scottish-specific interests, in the Cabinet or wherever in the House of Commons. That's what we ought to do. we would be the only party in Scotland, at any rate, that would be arguing for this. The others all rabbit on about being unionists, but they invariably talk about more powers for the Scottish Parliament, particularly the Conservatives, who love the Scottish Parliament. So there's nobody there arguing our case. To get elected in this, I won't go into how the electoral system, but about half of the seats, or slightly fewer than half of the seats, are first past the post, which we would struggle to win, but about just slightly less than 2/3 are on a list system, which is a joke in itself. We, UKIP, could potentially get a seat in each of the 8 regions of Scotland if we could get 5.6% of the vote. It's not that bad, it's definitely achievable. We've tried a few times, we haven't succeeded, partly because there are other parties who appear out of nowhere and suddenly stand in the Scottish elections who kind of slightly campaign for a similar territory to ourselves. But basically what I'm suggesting is that we unequivocally, emphatically, no nonsense, state as a party that throughout the UK we don't believe in devolution. We want rid of it. We want rid of it because it serves no purpose. We're a British party. We believe that all of the 4 nations are part of the same nation and have equal representation, percentage of the population-wise, in the House of Commons. Thank you.